AIDS brings a response
Fight
from the
against
government.
AIDS, the disease which claims life.
Welcome to AIDS the Lost Voices with me, William Hampson. In this series, we uncover the hidden history of people living with AIDS behind bars, prisoners who unwittingly became activists calling for reform within prison walls. We turn to the newspaper archives to look back at this neglected chapter of the AIDS crisis and the courageous struggle to change an unjust system. In the next two episodes, we'll look back at the press coverage of protests from both sides of the prison bars by inmates and jailers at Long Bay Jail in Australia, often referred to as Australia's toughest prison. We'll trace how newspapers framed grievances, responses, and the voices that were amplified and those that were silenced. I found many stories of protests rippling through prisons across Australia, stories of solidarity and defiance spreading as rapidly as the AIDS epidemic itself, from Goulburn Jail to Maitland, from Parramatta and Pentridge to Long Bay Jail itself. Reports of misinformation, fear, rumours and organised resistance. But in these episodes, we focus on a sequence of events at Long Bay Jail in Sydney, New South Wales, Australia. One of the earliest, but by no means the first, articles highlighting the conditions faced by inmates with AIDS appeared in the Sydney Morning Herald on the 18th of August 1985, under the stark headline, "Jailed Sufferers Treated Like the Plague." Where, they report, AIDS hysteria has hit Long Bay Jail, where free prisoners with the disease have been treated with such incidents as a prison officer ringing a bell near their unit and calling out, "Bring out your dead," in a mocking reference to the Black Plague of the Middle Ages. A report prepared by a prison officer about conditions in the AIDS unit says, quote, "The AIDS victims are being treated as if they are on death row," end quote. The prisoner's mail has been delivered covered in large red letters with the word, quote, "AIDS." The laundry service has refused to touch their washing, and they are forced to eat their meals in cells reserved for psychiatric patients on paper plates without any cell furniture. Because of the high rate of homosexual sex in the Long Bay prison complex, officers fear that any prisoner who has been in the AIDS unit will be certainly attacked and possibly killed by other prisoners if they are put back among the prison population. According to a detailed submission to the New South Wales AIDS Committee, volunteer prison officers in the AIDS unit were treated as, quote, "contaminated," end quote, by their workmates, and when they came into the staff dining room, officers would pack up their food and move away. One officer in the AIDS unit commented, quote, "The prisoners in the unit have so little to do, they just sit around and think about death," end quote. A prisoner inside the unit interviewed by the Sun Herald newspaper last week asked not to be identified for his family's sake because they did not know he was suffering from AIDS. Quote, "We are being treated like diseased animals in here. All we can do is sit around like eunuchs and vegetate. We need each other for comfort and support because fellow prisoners have been banned from coming to see us and all we think about now is AIDS and dying. It's disgusting." Corrective Services Minister Mr. John Ackister said yesterday, quote, "The departmental view is that the conditions aren't ideal, but they are satisfactory because no one in that unit is very ill," end quote. Oh gosh, it all sounds far too familiar, doesn't it? But at least it gives us a little snippet into 1985 and Long Bay Jail's AIDS separation unit or segregation unit. But 4 months later, the Sydney Morning Herald on the 18th of December 1985 highlighted much of the same AIDS hysteria that we faced here in the UK and they faced in the United States, where they ran the headline, "Police Say No to AIDS Prisoner," where they report, police refused to transport a prisoner on remand at Long Bay Jail to Waverley Court yesterday, saying the man was a, quote, "confirmed AIDS sufferer." Oh gosh. It is believed to be the first time Australian police have refused to move a suspect with AIDS. Chief Inspector Gordon Beardmore of Waverley Police Station said the prisoner definitely had AIDS and was a, quote, "suspected biter and spitter," end quote, adding that he was not prepared to put his officers at risk of contracting the disease. When the accused man's case was called, the magistrate declared him, quote, "not before the court," end quote, because he's obviously not present. It will now be up to the Corrective Services Department and the police to decide how the prisoner will be moved to face the 2 charges against him. Inspector Beardmore said, quote, "I have directed that I will not have him, the prisoner, in the precincts of this cell complex or this police station. Oh, get the madam. On Tuesday, the Chief Inspector issued an inter-office memo, quote, strongly recommending, end quote, against his officers using mouth-to-mouth resuscitation until safe equipment was issued, or it was proved AIDS could not be transmitted by saliva. Sources within the station said that a constable tried, unsuccessfully, to revive a woman last Thursday at Edgecliff Railway Station using the mouth-to-mouth technique. He later found out that the woman was a suspected hepatitis B and AIDS carrier. Police sources say she is believed to have died of a drug overdose. The acting Deputy Police Commissioner, Mr. Bob Shepherd, has called for a report on the refusal to move the prisoner. A spokesman for Mr. Shepherd said the transfer of prisoners suspected of having AIDS was normally handled by volunteers. He, Mr. Shepherd, asked for a report on the circumstances to be on his desk tomorrow. A spokesman for the Minister for Corrective Services, Mr. Akister, said if the police continued to refuse to transport prisoners suspected of having AIDS, talks would be held with the police department. Quote, I suspect the solution will be found firstly in education and, secondly, in making appropriate transport provisions available so police can be confident they are not at risk, the spokesman said. It would neither be feasible nor appropriate for the courts to be brought to the jails. Quote, this disease has taken on mythological proportions, although it is not larger than life, and I'm sure we can come to an amicable arrangement, he said. The Secretary of the Police Association, Mr. Bob Page, said they supported Inspector Beardmore's stand. A week ago, at a meeting with the Minister for Police, Mr. Anderson, it was decided a committee would be set up to look at the AIDS problem, Mr. Page said. Quote, we would support the approach of the Chief Inspector of Waverley that no member should be directed to jeopardise his own health or that of his family, end quote. A spokesman for Mr. Anderson said the ruling was an operational matter. Quote, ask Avery, it's a situation for the Commissioner. The President of the New South Wales AIDS Council, Mr. Lex Watson, described the police directive as unjustified, saying guidelines issued by the AIDS Task Force were quite adequate for handling prisoners with the disease. Hear, hear. A spokesman for the New South Wales Anti-Discrimination Board said the police action could be in breach of the anti-discrimination laws. Oh, hear, hear. You read these stories time and time again, and they do to a degree become quite repetitive. But your jaw just never ceases to drop. Nobody ever seemed to learn any lessons. Anyhow, across the AIDS Behind Bars series, we learned how prisons established separation or segregation units to isolate inmates diagnosed with HIV/AIDS. For instance, Arbour Hill in Dublin, the AIDS wings in Vacaville at the California Medical Facility, and now here, Australia's Long Bay Jail, and as you're about to learn, was called for a period the Malabar Assessment Unit, where prisoners labelled, quote, antibody positive, which retrospectively would be HIV positive, were housed separately from the main prison population. And on the 23rd of January 1988, Australia's The Sydney Morning Herald published an extensive piece that takes us inside the Malabar Assessment Unit at Long Bay Jail, offering an unflinching portrait of life behind its bars and introducing us to several inmates who tested antibody positive. The New South Wales prison system, in which as dozens reportedly share a single needle for the injection of heroin, is an AIDS time bomb, experts claim. The author of a report on AIDS in jail, Professor John Dwyer, says the extent of the disease has made jails, quote, the new jumping off point for AIDS into the heterosexual community, end quote. Yet a Herald investigation indicates one of the state government's key policies on AIDS in jails apparently has contributed to the disease's spread in the past 3 years. Doctors, social workers, and inmates interviewed this week said the segregation of those inmates tested positive had brought about a virtual collapse of the voluntary AIDS testing programs and caused prisoners to conceal infection. The policy has also created an extraordinary, quote, jail within a jail, end quote. The Malabar Assessment Unit at Long Bay is known to some inmates as the AIDS wing. To others, it's, quote, death row. The high-walled section houses those prisoners identified as antibody positive. The 9-cell unit has been the focus of tensions within the prison system over the AIDS menace. Incidents there have included the unprecedented imprisonment of a woman among the infected men, negotiations among prisoners for AIDS-infected blood, suicide, and the confiscation of condoms smuggled in. Quote, "They're leaving us to rot to show the public the government is doing something about AIDS," an inmate inside the unit said. "But they're preventing condoms being brought in jail and confiscating our needles. They're making the problem worse." Kerry Louise, a bank robber and transsexual, kept her private syringe hidden in a foam pillow while she served time in Long Bay Jail. Then, after a tip-off, 2 warders searched her cell and confiscated the hypodermic. Kerry Louise then sought to share other inmates' needles. For 2 weeks in 1985, she and 2 other men injected contraband heroin with a makeshift syringe. Now out of prison, off heroin and living in the suburbs, Kerry Louise is, quote, "getting my life together." Her tiny flat, decorated with pictures of movie stars and a tattooed lifer she fell in love with on the inside, is kept spotless. Kerry Louise, however, has less than 4 years to live. Through use of the shared needle, she believes, she became infected with the AIDS virus. Quote, "The Department of Corrective Services is responsible for imposing a death sentence on me," she claimed. "I don't know how many more who use that needle are going to die." End quote. After Kerry Louise stopped using it, the needle she injected with serviced dozens of other men for about a fortnight before falling apart. Among them was a man released shortly after into the arms of a girlfriend. Said Professor Dwyer, quote, "You get the virus in jail and it ping-pongs around the walls, hitting more and more people as it goes." The head of the prisons subcommittee of the National Advisory Committee on AIDS, NACAIDS, Professor Dwyer believes that in the past 12 months, prisons have emerged as a big AIDS danger to the general community, and he's not impressed with the government's response. Quote, "There are 15,000 people going through the New South Wales jails each year. These men are returning to wives, girlfriends, lovers. They're at risk and the general public is at risk. The Department of Corrective Services does not seem to be acting with the urgency the problem requires." End quote. Dr. Julian Gold, head of the Albion Street AIDS Clinic, the biggest treatment centre in Australia, said concentration of needle users in jail had created a hothouse effect for the virus. Quote, "The jails are now the most dangerous place for AIDS to spread into society." End quote. In New South Wales, at least one ex-prisoner has died of AIDS, thought to have been contracted in jail. Last Thursday, a transsexual who had planned legal action against the department, believing she had become infected with AIDS in jail, was found dead of a heroin overdose in a block of units in King's Cross. Friends believe her weakened health contributed to the lethal overdose. These deaths, it is quietly agreed by departmental officers and outside health officials, are just the beginning. The Department of Corrective Services officially recognises that just 7 men of the thousands of prisoners in New South Wales have the disease. NACAIDS estimates range from 150 to 200. Rumours of a secret report based on unauthorised blood tests which found a 30% infection rate in one jail have been denied by the department. The truth is that no one knows the extent of the problem behind prison walls. The department's voluntary testing programme has virtually collapsed. In the last 3 years, 2,000 were tested, 20 proved positive. About 43,000 others were not tested. The reason? Inmates must sign a declaration saying they will go into segregation should they test positive. But prison authorities point out testing doesn't stop the disease. Quote, "If we tested everyone tonight and found we have 100, 200 people positive, it doesn't solve what we are going to do with them," the New South Wales Corrective Services Commissioner, Dr. Glenys Hancock, said. So significant is the AIDS threat in prisons that the World Health Organization has become involved. In November, the former federal minister, Don Grimes, now ambassador to the Netherlands, chaired in Geneva the first World Health Organization meeting on AIDS in jails. The meeting, attended by experts from 26 countries, recommended an end to segregation of AIDS prisoners. Using the World Health Organization guidelines as a model, the New South Wales prison system is now locked into phase 1 of a massive and coordinated campaign against the disease. Quote, "At this stage, we are treating every prisoner as a potential positive to the virus," said Louisa Scagliotti, the AIDS project coordinator for New South Wales jails. However, critics say much time has been lost by the department. More important, many doctors, social workers, and inmates feel that the segregation policy undermines these efforts. Quote, "What they have done is to further the reach of the virus than if they had left the jails alone," said a jail social worker. And the segregation unit itself is a crime against humanity. The Malabar Assessment Unit stands beside one of the 100-year-old sandstone walls of Long Bay's Metropolitan Remand Prison. It consists of 9 cells of the former jail hospital. Its interior walls are painted a non-custodial shade of pink. Ooh. Outside in the yard, there's a fountain. At the end of the yard is a patch of bilious green synthetic grass. On this, there is an aluminium garden setting, complete with umbrella where the inmates entertain their visitors. David, 22, father of 6 and a heroin addict, has been in the unit for 18 months. He is a big man, tattooed but coyly childlike with a round, boyish face. Even though he is allowed up to 12 visits a week, he is barred from entering any other section of the prison except the prison oval, once a day but only at lunchtime when it's deserted. The isolation, he says, is starting to drive him mad. Quote, "I can't do work release. I can't get into the craft shops. I've just got to sit in this tiny yard. I got the disease because the jail wouldn't let me have a clean needle," he said. Significantly, David and the unit's 6 inmates claim that shared use of syringes, not sex, has given them the virus. He and another slightly less tattooed inmate have a message for other non-segregated prisoners. Quote, "We're telling everybody, don't take a test, because if you end up in here, it is worse than hell." End quote. So strong is the message that Long Bay's inmate newspaper has carried an article urging prisoners to boycott the test for their own good. The effect has been startling. The voluntary testing programme has come to a virtual halt through the lack of participants. The age unit has no additions from any of the 24 New South Wales jails in the last 4 months, despite an estimated 3,000 prisoners passing through the system in that time. In June last year, a NAC age report to the Corrective Services Commission revealed that prisoners at Long Bay had estimated that more than 200 people were injecting drugs about 3 times a week. The men shared a total of 14 syringes between them. The recent crackdown on drugs has seen the confiscation of a number of needles. Quote, "I know of other guys in the main jail who would have used the needle I caught AIDS from," David said. "If they put them all in isolation, they'd have to make the whole of the bay an AIDS ward." Perhaps symbolic of the frustration in jails about the AIDS threat are the cartons piled high in the Long Bay storeroom. They contain $57,000 worth of condoms waiting to be distributed. The Minister for Corrective Services, Mr. John Akerster, wants them out in the jails. The prison officers, led by Pat Armstrong, President of the State and Federal Prison Officers Association, do not. 11 weeks ago, the officers refused to cooperate with Corrective Services' pilot scheme to distribute the condoms in Bathurst Prison. Quote, "Bathurst Jail would be known as the Homo Jail of Australia," said Mr. Armstrong. "It's not fair to blokes who work there, or the prison, to be stuck with this burden." End quote. The prison officers' zealousness over condoms has extended to search and confiscate raids in the Long Bay Age Unit, prisoners claim. A senior counsellor of the Transsexual Service Centre, Tiresias House, Rika Griffiths, said her staff had been told they would be banned from ever returning if they brought a condom into the jail. When jail warders found that prisoners were using bleach to disinfect needles in a Sydney prison in 1986, they allegedly confiscated the bleach. A social worker claims the attitude of many warders has bordered on glee at the epidemic. At Long Bay, a prominent exercise yard sign urging prisoners to, quote, "stop the spread of AIDS," end quote, was reworded to read, quote, "help the spread," end quote. Only prison officers have access to that area. Meanwhile, the isolation unit at Long Bay has bred some extraordinary events. A week after Kerry Louise was transferred to the unit, another inmate was found dead. The AIDS sufferer had overdosed on pills hoarded from the daily medicine issues. Even within a prison such as Long Bay, the unit is remarkable for its suicide attempts. Quote, "Check our wrists, we've all got scars," said an inmate. A short time after the suicide, a woman, the first ever to spend time in a New South Wales men's jail, was admitted to the age unit. Out on bail on heroin charges, Jane, a boyish-looking woman with a predilection for wearing jeans, had volunteered for an AIDS test while waiting at a doctor's office. Quote, "When I went back to Malabar, women's jail, they got the results and I was whipped out of there in 20 minutes. I was still in shock from knowing I had AIDS and they threw me in this all-male jail," she said. Serving 3 terms from November 1985, Jay spent a total of 12 months locked up among men. A corrective services spokesman confirmed this week the woman had spent time in Long Bay. However, the spokesman said she was given special care by women prison officers. Jane, now struggling on a methadone program, said life in the unit was heavy but bearable. Quote, "It is just outrageous that they put me there in the first place," she said. "It was for the screw's benefit, not mine. I know the women at Malabar would have been cool about AIDS." End quote. Along with Jane, the unit sometimes has up to 4 of 10 cells occupied by transsexuals, quote, "men," end quote, whose nature or hormones give them the looks and personality of a woman.
When I met Sharon and Cheryl, the first thing they asked me was if they could borrow my lipstick, because as transsexuals they're not allowed to have any makeup of their own. And as for interviewing 2 people who dressed and looked like women in an all-male prison, can only be described as bizarre.
I got charged with stealing, assault and goods in custody, which I beat in court. I beat all the charges.
I'm in for 7 counts of armed robbery to support a heroin habit when I was out.
Before I got released from jail on my last flagon, I was at the MRP. Now that used to be all the transsexuals jail. Like there wasn't all transsexuals there, but that's where they used to house all us girls, right? Well, I used to be there all the time, wasn't I, Chef?
Yeah.
I was there all the time and just not one bit of trouble. The guys just thoroughly respect the girls.
My boyfriend was recently released. He comes out and visits me, but before he was released, we were in a 2-out cell, in this actual cell now, and we were having sex constantly together, you know, and I'm not afraid to admit it, you know, and he's still with me now and still comes out and visits me.
Do people try to have sex with you?
Occasionally you get asked, you know, somebody will come up.
How about it, Sharon? Or, you know, it's usually a nice set of tits there. Or,
you know, but they'll slap you on the backside and just say, be up there later.
Yeah, but you just,
you don't, something like that.
You don't be nasty to them.
You know?
Like I just say, oh yeah, sweet, and just shrug it and walk away, you know.
You know, people turn around and say, oh, what's my chances?
Yeah,
I'd
say it like this, Buckley's and none.
You got 2, love.
You got 2? Yeah, that's it, you got 2, Buckley's and none.
Now, on your bike.
A bizarre series of photos taken at the unit's 1985 Christmas party show a group split between denim and dresses. I mean, what's so bizarre about that? Some transsexuals found the unit offered a respite from the rapes and bashings outside. Kerry Louise said, quote, "I had friends still on the outside begging me for a syringe full of my blood so they could get inside here, out of the main jail. I never did it. I never gave it to them. It would have been murder." During the early part of the unit's operation, it gained an unjust reputation as a place for, quote, "dogs," end quote, informers. Inmates fought the rumours with an article in Long Bay's in-house magazine. Equally inaccurate yard gossip depicted the unit as a pit of rotting infection. Quote, "We look no different. We haven't got scabs on our faces and arms, and we surely do not crouch in the corner, rotting away like lepers," Kerry Louise, one of the unit's few HSC graduates, wrote in the jail newspaper. The New South Wales Corrective Services Department may be sitting on a legal as well as a epidemiological time bomb. A 1986 internal publication by the US Department of Justice warned of a, quote, "sharp increase," end quote, in lawsuits brought by prisoners over AIDS-related issues in the previous year. These included a Colorado discrimination claim where AIDS-positive prisoners were placed next to those on death row. Several others cite the whole legality of segregation and compulsory testing as discrimination and invasion of privacy. Perhaps the most potentially damaging are those who say a jail's mandate to protect the health and well-being of its inmates is breached by the spread of AIDS inside. Quote, "If there are cases in the United States, we are going to get similar ones here," a solicitor from the Redfern Legal Aid Centre said this week. One of the centre's solicitors has already investigated suing jail authorities for confiscating a Long Bay prisoner's hypodermic syringe, which allegedly led to the acquisition of AIDS through a shared needle. Another solicitor had heard claims that at least 2 uninfected transsexuals were transferred to the AIDS unit on the presumption of infection and acquired the disease after being raped inside. A spokesman for the department said this could not have been possible because medical checks were required before admission unless an inmate declared himself infected. Already, the New South Wales Anti-Discrimination Board has clashed with the department over its handling of AIDS. In 1986, Senior Consultation Officer Greg Tillett took complaints from a number of AIDS unit inmates for discrimination, harassment and gross breaches of privacy. Quote, "I found a number of areas unsatisfactory," Mr. Tillett said. Among the practices changed was the prominent addressing of prisoners' mail with the words, quote, AIDS unit, end quote, and a publicly displayed board that issued the names of those in the section. A spokesman for Mr. Akister said the department had not been served with any writs from inmates or staff over AIDS issues. The nature of the disease makes the source of infection almost impossible to prove. Inside the Long Bay AIDS unit this month, David has been trying to get a female to pair with one of his male budgies. During his time inside its walls, caged birds with mixed success. Quote, "It's not much good," he said. "I end up sorry for them and let them out of their cage." The hobby is a way to keep his mind off his segregation. Quote, "You sometimes can't stop thinking about it as death row. The thoughts go round and round in your head and you don't stop. You cry a bit at night sometimes, but that isn't going to make it go away." Oh gosh, it sounds amazing. Where can I sign up for 2 weeks at the Malabar Assessment Unit? It sounds delightful. It doesn't, it sounds horrendous. And prison's obviously not meant to be nice, but I mean, come on. Oh gosh. But as for David, well, we hear more about David on the front page of the very same newspaper on the very same day, under the headline, "Love Without Hope, Barred by Prison Walls." The barbed wire-topped block is officially called the Malabar Assessment Unit, but prison slang calls it Death Row. It houses prisoners with AIDS inside Sydney's toughest prison, Long Bay. It is also where Tanya Spence and David Eames fell in love. Tanya, 22, a transsexual, jailed for prostitution, heroin use and robbery, met David, 22, a tattooed father of 6, jailed for heroin possession and rape at the end of 1986, when she first went into the AIDS ward. Tanya is now out of jail, and that is the problem. She longs to be together with David, but she says prison authorities are preventing her from seeing him. The two speak of each other the way any lovers might. Quote, "What I like about Tanya is her sweetness, the way she needs protecting," says David. "She has copped it rough all her life and I want to look after her." Tanya, who as a boy was called Scott, says of David, quote, "We met each other and I like him a lot. He means a lot to me. I've been trying to visit him and they won't let me." David Eames, wearer of 57 mostly self-drawn tattoos, believes he caught AIDS from a needle shared in jail. AIDS experts believe that New South Wales jails are a breeding ground for AIDS, with up to 200 inmates of the state's jails having the disease. Tanya blames the prison authorities. She says they put her in the unit when she was not infected by AIDS, merely because she was a hard-to-place transsexual they thought would have the virus. She says she was raped by 2 men within days of arriving in the unit, then became infected. However, a spokesman for the Minister for Corrective Services, Mr. Akister, said checks before entry to the unit made it unlikely anyone not infected could be locked in the unit and infected inside. Towards the end of last year, Long Bay authorities decided the AIDS unit, then full to capacity, was to move from an old 10-cell unit to a roomier 9-cell block in the jail's old hospital. All the inmates of the unit had AIDS tests before the move, Tanya said. They all came back stamped positive, except for the young transsexuals, which were negative. The negative result meant she would go back into the main section of the jail, away from the protection of her lover. The pair cooked up a plan. Quote, "I knew I already had AIDS, so me and David decided to make up a story that I injected myself with AIDS-infected blood so I could stay in the unit. Eames asked a reporter from the Daily Telegraph to visit him in jail. He gave him the story of injected blood. It ran spectacularly with the headline, "Love Crazy Prisoner Gives Himself AIDS," on October the 10th last year, which would have been 1987. But the lover's plan backfired. Quote, "I was back in the main section of the jail anyway," Tanya said, "and they barred me from seeing David." 2 months ago, Tanya was released from Long Bay. Despite the test result that removed her from the unit with her lover, she is now a confirmed AIDS sufferer. Quote, "But now I am out, they are stopping me from seeing David. I don't know why," she said. Despite her illness, Tanya says she has tried to visit David at least 10 times since her release. Prison officers have refused to let her in the jail gates, all but once, on Christmas Day. And above the article is a fabulous picture of what was termed then transsexual Tanya stood outside the Malabar Assessment Unit. But I don't know about you, I'm a tad confused. If Tanya says that she knows she is HIV positive, then why the need for the story of injecting herself with David's HIV positive blood when she is being moved out of the AIDS separation unit and back into the main population, when surely she'd test positive anyway, because as she said, she knew she was HIV positive. In any event, as Tanya shared, their plan backfired and Tanya was moved back to the main population before eventually serving her time and being released. But it was another HIV positive prisoner, 10 months later, housed at Long Bay's Malabar Assessment Unit, who, when transferred to the main population of another prison, sparked immediate unrest. Fellow prisoners hurled threats to, quote, iron bar the prisoner. Warders, gripped by panic and misconceptions about AIDS transmission, walked out in protest, while the transferred prisoner stood alone at the centre of a crisis born as much of ignorance and stigma as of penal policy, where the Sydney Morning Herald reported on the 14th of November 1988, an indefinite strike by 350 prison officers from Maitland and Cessnock jails could spread statewide as the Prison Officers Association steps up its fight against AIDS-positive inmates living with the general prison community. Warders from Maitland Jail walked off the job indefinitely on Friday after an AIDS-positive prisoner arrived from Sydney on the way to a court hearing in Port Macquarie. They went on strike in protest at the transfer, believing that the prisoner should have been kept at the Long Bay AIDS unit until the date of the hearing. On Saturday, prison officers from nearby Cessnock Jail went on strike in support of their colleagues. The prison officers will meet this morning at Cessnock Jail to plan further action. The Secretary of the Prison Officers Association, Mr. Pat Armstrong, said yesterday that it was likely that the officers, quote, would vote to seek statewide support, end quote. Mr. Armstrong said the AIDS-positive prisoner at Maitland Jail had been threatened after he arrived. Quote, a number of other prisoners told him they would iron bar him. That's the way it works in here, he said. Oh, well, take their iron bars up. Where are they getting these iron bars from? Oh, shocking. The Prison Officers Association is pushing for AIDS wings to be incorporated into jails. Mr. Armstrong says it was imperative that the units were staffed by prison officers who choose to work there, and that professional backup and counselling staff were available. But Professor John Dwyer, a consultant on AIDS to the Department of Corrective Services, said the fears of the prison officers were magnified out of all proportion. Quote, how unfortunate it is that prison officers are taking this attitude after the education programme we have in place, he said. So there we have it. The prison officers are going on strike. They had this fear, they had a right to strike, and so they did. And subsequent press reports confirmed that 350 warders all voted in favour on continuing their strike action. And I also learned that the prison's only concern seemed to be if the HIV-positive prisoner was to be violently attacked with an iron bar, as some inmates had threatened, was, quote, posing risks of AIDS contamination, end quote. Of course, I assume from any spillage of blood that resulted from an attack. I mean, no, you can't make it up. It's sickening if that was their first, main and only concern. I mean, it's horrible. 9 days after the warders went on strike, we hear of an update where the Sydney Morning Herald on the 20th of November 1988 ran the headline, Dilemma of Death Row. Death row being the term the inmates used to refer to the AIDS wing, where, they report, an AIDS-infected prisoner at the centre of mass walkouts by prison staff may have been planted by the government as a litmus test, prison officers claimed yesterday. New South Wales Prison Officers Association President Pat Armstrong said they suspected the inmate had been sent to Maitland Jail to, quote, provoke officers opposing the government policy of integrating AIDS-infected inmates into the prison system. Warders from Maitland Jail went on strike on November the 11th after objecting to the transfer of an AIDS-infected prisoner. The following day, warders at Cessnock also walked out. Both groups believed the prisoner should have remained at the Long Bay's AIDS unit until his court appearance at Port Macquarie in January. The Maitland incident has inflamed the relationship between prison officers and the Corrective Services Department. Corrective Services Minister Mr Michael Yabsley has already been under attack from prison staff over his change of policy on AIDS inmates. In a letter to the Prison Officers Association on March the 15th this year, Mr Yabsley, then member for Bly and opposition prison spokesman, stated, quote, all prisoners who carry AIDS will be accommodated in appropriate segregation facilities, end quote. In his statement to the Bauer inquiry on October the 11th, however, Mr Yabsley said, quote, very shortly a programme will be announced to integrate AIDS carriers into the prison population, end quote. Last Thursday, the Prison Officers Association lodged requests for the Maitland prisoners' transfer back to Long Bay. Quote, the Maitland situation was provocative to bring something to a head, Mr Armstrong said. The prisoner didn't have to go to Maitland. He was a prisoner finishing his sentence off and was a remand prisoner. It would have been more appropriate for him to stay at Long Bay. It may well be that some people in the Corrective Services Department felt that the thing was going to be brought to a head in terms of the integration policy. He could well have been a litmus test for the policy, end quote. Mr Armstrong said the infected inmate had been threatened by fellow prisoners while at Maitland. Quote, when the guy went to Maitland and was put into B wing, the wing officer was told that if they didn't get him out of there, they, inmates, were going to iron bar him, Mr Armstrong said. After last week's strike, Mr Yabsley said he would consider setting up isolated areas for prisoners with AIDS if there was excessive violence against AIDS sufferers. It's all very serious, isn't it? But it all just seemed to be just a lot of handbags. And alongside the article is a companion piece featuring transsexual Tanya Spence, captured in a striking photograph as she gazes out through an open door, where the article is titled, If Only They Understood. Tanya Spence, a 22-year-old transsexual with full-blown AIDS, blames the prison system for the disease she has been told will kill her within 6 months. Tanya, pictured above, was put in the AIDS unit of Long Bay Jail because she was a hard-to-place criminal authorities thought would have the virus. She believes she got AIDS there when she was raped by 2 men with the virus, but she concedes she could have caught it working the streets as a prostitute or when she shared needles to inject heroin. Tanya has experienced the AIDS unit, known as death row to prisoners, and the main sections of several jails, including Long Bay, Goulburn and Cessnock, where she says at 17 she was pack-raped by 15 men. She's been in the AIDS unit at Long Bay Jail 3 times. Quote, the boredom was unbelievable. It makes you even more depressed, being locked up in a place where people are dying. End quote. The AIDS unit has 9 single cells and a large leisure room with television, video and pool table. Tanya believes in integration and said, quote, if the prisoners and screws understood the disease, maybe then it would work, end quote. Tanya said prisoners shared needles to inject heroin and conceded this made the risks of putting AIDS sufferers in with other prisoners high. Quote, I've been in a room with 10 guys and they've all used the same needle, Tanya said. They just don't care. They just need the drug so much. She saw no heroin in the AIDS unit, so sharing of needles was not a problem. But prisoners did have sex with each other. It was in the AIDS unit she met her boyfriend, David, in jail for heroin possession and rape. He is still in jail, and Tanya, who was released 1 year ago this week, still longs for him. Quote, I used to get condoms brought in, but the screws would take them away, she said. We were having sex without condoms and I didn't realise it could reinfect me, end quote. As I briefly mentioned in a previous episode, a journalist who dismissed the prisoners at Dublin's Arbour Hill and Mountjoy prisons who led hunger strikes and rooftop protests as not being activists because, in his view, they lacked a network, phone lines, printers, posters and flyers, yet the Oxford English Dictionary defines activism simply as, quote, the use of vigorous campaigning to bring about political or social change, which proves it's not all about fancy office equipment or highlighter pens. We can acknowledge the complex feelings around the warder's refusal to accommodate a HIV-positive prisoner, feelings that include stigma and discriminatory practice, while also recognising the warder's right to protest by strike action, even if their tactics did not secure the outcome that they so desperately sought. And as we just heard, a year on the outside, Tanya raises a parallel but personal concern, being denied the right to visit David and arguing from lived experience that HIV-positive prisoners should be allowed to serve among the general population. Her testimony underscores that the debate is not a theoretical one about communications or credentials, but about real people, rights, and the material consequences of exclusion behind bars. But then, Tanya's bid to control the narrative spectacularly backfired 9 months later in August 1989, when her appearance on Australian TV sent shockwaves across the globe. From the San Francisco Examiner to Canada's Montreal Gazette and the UK's Manchester Evening News, culminating in a stark front-page report in the Sydney Morning Herald on the 4th of August 1989 that reported, the Minister for Health, Mr. Collins, appealed last night for help in identifying AIDS-infected people who may still be working as prostitutes. Mr. Collins made his appeal following an interview on Channel 9 with a 22-year-old transsexual prostitute who claimed she had had sex with possibly thousands of men since contracting the AIDS virus about 4 years ago. The prostitute, identified as Tanya Spence, said that while she always insisted clients wore condoms, she never warned them that she was an AIDS carrier. Quote, they wouldn't go with me if I told them, she said. Ms. Spence said she knew of at least 15 to 20 other prostitutes who had tested HIV positive but were still working in King's Cross. She told a reporter from A Current Affair that she was sure health authorities would, quote, put me in a hospital eventually. I don't think I should be locked up, she said. I haven't harmed anyone. Ms. Spence is the second Sydney prostitute to admit continuing to work despite having contracted the AIDS virus. Earlier this week, a prostitute and heroin addict identified as Charlene was detained under Section 32A of the New South Wales Public Health Act after she admitted to having had sex with men, often without a condom. Charlene is being held in a special unit set up in a major Sydney public hospital to detain AIDS carriers, including prostitutes and addicts who are deemed to pose a public health threat. Mr. Collins said last night that his department had a responsibility to ensure the maintenance of public health standards, but was unable to, quote, round up, end quote, people suspected of having AIDS. Quote, I therefore appeal to the media to provide information to the department which may identify people who, knowing they have the disease, continue to work as prostitutes. I have asked Channel 9 to place all information it has on Tanya and others before the department. This action is essential to guarantee public health, he said. A spokesman for Channel 9 said it was understood that Miss Spence had been counselled and had agreed to turn herself in to health authorities today. The detention unit set up by Mr. Collins is being guarded round the clock by police. This follows a request from Mr. Collins to the Minister of Police, Mr. Pickering, for the provision of, quote, appropriate security, end quote, for AIDS carriers detained under Section 32A. The whereabouts of the unit is being kept secret. It will be staffed by about 10 people, including 3 nurses providing medical supervision round the clock, and a health department counsellor who is likely to spend 5 to 8 hours a day working with patients. There is no doctor permanently attached to the unit, but the hospital has agreed to make a resident medical officer available when needed. The relevant authorities do speak with Tanya Spence, where the Sydney Morning Herald the following day, 5th of August 1989, report. The state government has decided not to detain a Sydney prostitute who claims to have had sex with possibly thousands of men since she contracted the AIDS virus 4 years ago. The Minister for Health, Mr Collins, said he would not invoke Section 32A of the New South Wales Public Health Act because he was satisfied that the prostitute, Ms Tanya Spence, did not pose a public health threat, quote, at this stage, end quote. Section 32 was used earlier this week to detain another prostitute identified as Charlene in a special unit set up by the government in a major Sydney public hospital to house AIDS carriers who behave, quote, irresponsibly, end quote. Mr Collins said Miss Spence, a 22-year-old transsexual, had been contacted yesterday morning by officers of the New South Wales Health Department following her appearance on the Channel 9 programme A Current Affair. He said the officers were satisfied that she was not working as a prostitute and was receiving adequate medical attention and counselling. Quote, "We have made extensive inquiries and it appears that Ms Spence is not working as a prostitute and has not done so in recent days, since she was discharged from Prince Henry Hospital about a week or so ago," Mr Collins said. Therefore, the provisions of the Public Health Act do not apply. However, if she were to go back to prostitution, then it would be necessary to act immediately, he said. Mr Collins said that while Miss Spence's illness was more advanced than Charlene's, Miss Spence clearly did not pose the same threat to public health because she had agreed to counselling and medical help. He warned that even if the government took drastic measures, such as the introduction of compulsory HIV antibody testing for non-prostitutes, no one could guarantee AIDS-free prostitution. Quote, "There is a warning to every potential client out there. They really have to think twice about using a prostitute because what they are doing is playing a game of Russian roulette," he said. Mr Collins was highly critical of the behaviour of what he described as, quote, certain sections of the media, following reports that Channel 9 had paid some of Miss Spence's expenses after she had agreed to appear on air. These expenses are understood to have included the cost of hiring a room at a North Shore motel, food, some legal expenses, and other, quote, incidentals, end quote. When she appeared on Channel 9 on Thursday night, Ms Spence said that while she always insisted clients wore condoms, she never warned them that she was an AIDS carrier. She also said that she knew of at least 15 to 20 other prostitutes who had tested HIV positive and still working in King's Cross, some without condoms. And later in the month, the Sydney Morning Herald reported that local clinics see an absolute deluge, a rush of Charlene's clients in a panic and seeking to be tested. Then, 2 months later, on the 21st of October 1989, in a bizarre plot twist, the Sydney Morning Herald run the headline, "Prison Officers Jail Love." Are you ready? I still can't believe this one, but here goes. A young woman prison officer fell in love with, then married a convicted rapist suspected of having AIDS. Now she's campaigning to have him released from jail. Trish Eames, 23, met her husband David, remember David, Tanya's boyfriend, the one with the budgies. David met her husband David while he was in the Malabar Assessment Unit, known as Death Row, among the prisoners at Long Bay, because it houses prisoners who have contracted the AIDS virus. Quote, "When I had my low moments, I shared them with him and he shared his with me, and we fell in love," Trish told the Sun Herald yesterday. Oh, I'm all for falling in love, but this has got April Fools slapped all over it. I'm still reading this now. I've read it a couple of times in preparation for this episode, but I just can't get my head around it. Anyhow, it's real. Soon after their wedding 6 weeks ago, Trish resigned from the prison service and now lives in a caravan park near Kirkconnell Jail, Bathurst, where Eames is serving the remainder of a 6.5-year sentence. Oh, gosh. I mean, what do you make of it? It's a proper clanger, isn't it? But wait, it gets better. When the couple's year-long romance began, Eames, now 24, was believed to have had AIDS because a random test gave an inaccurate reading. But later, a blood test proved he was not HIV positive. Oh my gosh, I'm thinking ka-ching, hello, lawsuit. In the meantime, he spent 2 years with AIDS-infected prisoners, and Trish is angry that prison authorities did not move him from the AIDS unit for 6 months after it was revealed that he was not infected. Quote, "It was only at my insistence they moved him," Trish said. "They gave no reasons for keeping him in there. They just put the issue in the too hard basket. I got on to the Ombudsman, Civil Liberties and Corrective Services Minister Michael Yabsley. They moved him in 3 weeks after that." Trish said she was worried the same mistake could be made with many more patients if compulsory AIDS testing of prisoners comes in. Quote, "They said David was a unique case, but it could happen again," she said. Trish has already succeeded in having her husband moved from the maximum security at Long Bay Jail to minimum security at Kirkconnell. But she wants more than just a change of prisons. She wants time taken off his term. Eames applied for release on licence, but since a brief hearing in March this year, he has heard nothing. A spokesman for Mr Yabsley said Eames had been removed from the AIDS unit and was, quote, "not going to get it both ways," end quote. Oh my goodness, what an absolute twist. How do you even begin to unpick that article, especially when there were no other articles in the press at the time, except for 2 years later, while David, still having many years left on his sentence to serve, on the 28th of October 1991, aged 26, David Eames sadly dies. Now, you're as much in the dark as I am regarding the cause of death, and that uncertainty makes it hard not to read any negative test, as we heard in the article, as possibly being a false negative, or to suspect other factors were at play. Tanya's account that the pair had unprotected sex multiple times while she was HIV positive, and David's own admission that he shared needles with inmates that later found to be HIV positive, point toward a plausible route of transmission. The Corrections Department's claim that inmates were only placed on the Malabar Assessment Unit were after testing positive, to which we heard in the article that positive proved to be a false positive. Or did it? And the fact that he died so young at only 26 makes AIDS-related complications a credible explanation. But, equally without official confirmation, other possibilities remain. Perhaps a fatal overdose, given he admitted himself that he used heroin, an unreported suicide or other illness, or perhaps even natural causes. In short, the available testimonies and institutional statements suggest HIV/AIDS is likely, but the absence of definitive medical confirmation, given I'm here in the UK and this is in Australia, means we cannot rule out other causes. But what we can say with absolute certainty is that 26 is no age for your life to come to an end. As for Tanya Spence, well, the following year, she's in trouble, where 3 months after David's death, the Sydney Morning Herald on the 7th of February 1990 run the headline, AIDS prostitute bit policeman, where they report a transvestite prostitute with AIDS bit a police officer on the arm as he was being questioned about an incident in King's Cross, Central Local Court, heard yesterday. And you can see actually the change in language with the Sydney Morning Herald. Previously it was transsexual and it was she, her. Here it's transvestite and he, him. The article goes on. Tanya Spence, 24, address suppressed, lashed out at Constable Greg Wright, biting his arm, breaking the skin and drawing blood, Sergeant Graham Adams told the court. Spence was first apprehended by Mr Joe Chianu after he caught him kicking his car on Darlinghurst Road at 12:45am on Monday night, Sergeant Adams said. Mr Chianu flagged down a passing police car and officers then tried to question Spence. Spence tried to leave the scene, was restrained and then began to lash out, Sergeant Adams said. He was charged with assault, malicious wounding and 3 charges of resisting police. There are 51 prior convictions for stealing, soliciting, possessing illegal drugs and false pretences against Spence, Sergeant Adams told Magistrate Mr Ruford Rydell. Spence was bailed on his own reconnaissance and a $500 bond to appear in Central Local Court on March the 6th. And sadly I can't bring you any follow-up because there isn't one in the newspaper archives. But the next time Tanya is mentioned in the press was in Australia's newspaper, The Age, on the 22nd of January 1999. Tanya Spence died peacefully at home on Wednesday, January the 20th. Much loved friend of Margaret, Moira, Jenny and Fran, and all at Rosehaven. May peace and everlasting joy be yours. Rosehaven was said to be Australia's first HIV/AIDS facility, a home solely for women and children with HIV/AIDS, offering care and tranquility. Back at the AIDS separation wing at Long Bay Jail, where on the 4th of February 1989, the Sydney Morning Herald again gained access to the unit, offering an unvarnished glimpse into the lives of the inmates there, where, they report. Tucked away in the corner of Long Bay Jail is a small well-attended garden with a fountain and a birdcage. Next to it is a long veranda and 9 cells in what was the old prison hospital. The inmates make themselves as comfortable as possible, with fish tanks, Marilyn Monroe photos and even a brass rubbing of a marijuana leaf. This is the Malabar Assessment Unit, or the AIDS Unit, but the prisoners call it Death Row. In opposition, the present Minister for Corrective Services, Mr Yabsley, was adamant that AIDS prisoners would be segregated and compulsory testing would be conducted throughout the prison system. But acting on medical advice and faced with many problems, he has done an about-face on segregation, and legal complications have forced him to opt for less than full compulsory testing. Pilot tests beginning next month may show what everyone fears, but no one knows for certain, that the prisons, as incubators for the virus, are a big danger to the community. The fraught debate over AIDS in jails continues, but for the inmates, it's the only home they have. Many have been convicted for minor offences or merely on remand, but they're doing their time hard, in maximum security, with no day leave and, though facing their own personal death sentences, just one phone call a week. A major problem is mind-numbing boredom. They have a saying, SOS, same old shit. At night, walking the only corridor or playing table tennis with the same opponent, they may start talking. Then they stop, realising they're saying exactly what they said to the same person the night before. When they go to the main prison for their twice-weekly visits, they feel officers and other inmates gawk at them as if they were lepers. There are few secrets in prisons. Everyone knows they're the AIDS patients. They worry about confidentiality, but more basically, they worry about their health and the lack of fresh fruit and appropriate medication. Darren, 20, from Sydney, is remanded in jail on fraud and embezzlement charges. He was raped in prison 2 years ago and believes he caught the AIDS virus then. This time in jail, he was put in the protection unit and almost raped again. He was glad to get to the AIDS unit a week ago. Anything was better than where he was. Quote, "I don't feel bitter," he says. "I got myself into jail." Bob, 35, is a carpenter. He is in jail for breaking and entering and possessing marijuana. He contracted the virus shooting up with his brother and girlfriend. They, like Bob, are already showing the first symptoms of AIDS. Bob learned he had it when he began to feel ill a year ago. He says his family has been hounded from place to place for the crime of loving a son who is HIV positive. Paul, 28, from Sydney, was diagnosed 4 years ago and is doing 5 months for breaking and entering. The AIDS unit is full, so at night he is housed in a nearby cell block with only a radio to amuse him. Quote, "I took about 2 years to come to terms with it," Paul said. "It hit me hard. A friend was diagnosed at the same time and overdosed. That set me thinking and made me grateful for life." Mark, 30, from Sydney, is serving 13 years for robbery. He's worked in bars and restaurants and is employed in the jail's tailor shop. He's gay and flippant and feels reasonably well, so far. He feels his life has been prolonged because he's been locked inside, away from the nightlife. 2 years ago, Mark had an AIDS test at Maitland. One day at 3 p.m, he was told he was positive. By 5 p.m, he was in the van heading for Sydney. Quote, "I freaked out," he says. "I didn't expect to be positive. All I knew about AIDS was that it kills me. I was with another guy who was trying to kill me because he blamed me for getting it." Mark is the unit's only inmate on the life-prolonging drug AZT. Bob, Darren, Mark and the 43 others who have passed through the unit since it was established 4 years ago may be the only visible tip of a problem that could change corrective services in New South Wales forever. Good nutrition is crucial to maintain a healthy immune system, but prisoners are given only one piece of fruit a day and must buy their own vitamins. Only one of the patients in the AIDS unit is on the life-prolonging drug AZT. The others say they also should have the option. But at $10,000 a year per patient, the cost of issuing the drug to 400 prisoners would give heartburn to any minister responsible. Oh gosh, what an awful term. AIDS is aggravated by stress, yet what could be more stressful than sitting around with a group of other prisoners bored witless and waiting to die? And what could be more stressful than being in a jail system where you are persecuted, bashed or even treated like a leper for being HIV positive? Mr. Pat Armstrong, chairman of the Prison Officers branch of the New South Wales Public Service Association, says that if AIDS carriers are not isolated, prison officers may go on strike throughout New South Wales, as they did at Maitland last year. Quote, "I wish Mr. Yabsley would pay more attention to prison officers rather than the medicos," Mr. Armstrong said. "They are lay people. Half of them wouldn't know what the inside of a prison looked like. They are dealing with theory, not reality. What we should try and do is identify areas of the jail for people with contagious diseases and have them looked after properly, with proper professional counselling and voluntary prison officers suitable to work in that sort of environment." But the indications are that prison officers and inmates are terrified of AIDS carriers. Prisoners are taught about safe sex and cleaning syringes, but condoms aren't issued in jail, and bleach, to sterilise syringes, has been largely removed. This has stirred strong emotions. Prisoners see it as tantamount to murder, and ignoring the reality that a demoralised addict in jail will do anything to get a fix, even share a syringe. Long-term prisoner and playwright Neil Carroll says it is a Boy Scout mentality to believe that people who use needles deserve what they get. The risk of dying as a result of a shot of heroin is something an addict thinks about only afterwards. Dr. Peter Bruce, who lectures on AIDS at Long Bay, says it has dramatically cut sexual abuse among prisoners, but drugs are another matter. Most prisoners are aged 18 to 35, and an estimated 3 out of 4 use drugs. They enter the jail hanging out from their drug habit, with their self-esteem at its lowest. Quote, "They will use anything, any sort of equipment they can get their hands on to shoot up," Dr. Bruce said. Hitting prisoners with education programs when they enter jail, when they are in crisis and have the highest potential for change, is probably the most effective time. The push within the Department of Corrective Services has been for prisoners themselves to be as involved as much as possible in AIDS education. Action committees of inmates and officers have been formed in many jails. Peer training programs are also being started, not only to warn prisoners about risky behaviour, but to support those found HIV positive. An entertaining education tool is the prison theatre group From the Nick, which performs plays by Neil Carroll. Miles from Nowhere and Denise's News. A laugh of recognition goes through the prisoners at Malabar Training Centre when they see one of their fellows, quote, shoot up heroin on stage, make a typical stone gesture and throw up in the toilet. Quote, great, he says as he wipes his mouth. Again, the audience laughs. But the laughter turns bitter when a prisoner has an AIDS test. His 2-week wait for the results becomes torment as he remembers the number of fits, syringes, he's shared in prison. It's so boring in here. A bloke will do anything to get away, even for a couple of hours, says one character. In one play, a prisoner hangs himself after learning he has the virus. In another, an inmate tells his girlfriend that she and her unborn child might have contracted AIDS on his last home visit. The prospect of being sent to the AIDS unit hangs over prisoners. Quote, the unit is horrific, Carroll says. Imagine how depressing it is to be locked up with a dozen other guys wondering, when are you going to die? End quote. As the politicians and professionals argue over courses of action, life goes on in death row. At 7 a.m, the doors are opened and prisoners are allowed out into the garden. At 4:30 p.m, the doors are shut, and prisoners can move around only inside the unit. At 9 p.m, the cell doors are shut. Then each prisoner is left to himself and his thoughts. It's too late for regrets, but as they wake up in the night, Paul may look around his cell and think, quote, dear, this is the pits. Mark may once again dream of Pat Cash. Bob will think of his family and his 2 children. Darren will wish he was with those he loves. And Greg, 42, who has been in the unit for only 3 weeks, will pray to God, quote, "When you're in this situation, that's the only thing you can do," he said. And you can read that entire article in full on the Extra T blog. But it also mentioned inmate Neil Carroll, a playwright who had written several plays addressing HIV/AIDS, which the prison's amateur dramatic group performed for fellow prisoners and members of the public the year prior, where the Sydney Morning Herald on the 9th of December 1988 ran the following advert. If you haven't heard that prisons are high-risk spots for the spread of the AIDS virus, the inmates at Malabar Training Centre at Long Bay Jail want to tell you all about it. They are putting on From the Nick, we don't think they're referring to Father Christmas, 2 plays by Neil Carroll as part of the AIDS education programme in jails. It's on Sunday only, so if you're keen to support the prisoners, make sure you ring them before and confirm. Security means that unless you have a confirmation before the performance, they can't let you in. And to think most people want to get out. Ring Diana la-di-da-di-da-da-da. With that, I tried to find out more about Neil Carroll, but many of Australia's local newspapers that would perhaps report on individual crimes and court proceedings are not yet uploaded in the newspaper archives. However, the Sydney Morning Herald reported that Neil Ernest Carroll, aged 24 in 1970 and a labourer of Farrell Street, Sydney, had participated with 2 other men in the armed robbery of a used car dealership with a rifle and got away with over $1,000 in cash. Neil pleaded guilty to the armed robbery, 3 charges of breaking and entering and stealing, and 2 additional charges of stealing, and asked the judge to take into account a further 19 charges of burglary of residential properties, indicating a significant criminal history, to which the judge sentenced Neil to 13 years imprisonment. So, why or how Neil is either still or back inside at Long Bay in 1988, I couldn't establish, but that uncertainty only sharpens the point of this AIDS Behind Bars series. Incarceration collapses the social margins where stigma thrives, and in those crucibles, people whom society might otherwise ignore were compelled to confront AIDS together. Within Long Bay, prisoners, many written off by the outside world, became unlikely educators, advocates, swapping scarce facts, nursing one another, and organising resistance to the fear and misinformation that raged on both sides of the prison bars. In January 1989, Neil's plays were again open to the public, and the article shares that Neil is an inmate of the Malabar Unit, the AIDS unit, and the cast of his plays are made up of inmates of the AIDS wing. In a Sydney Morning Herald piece on the 28th of June 1989, reporter Jill Margot, a name familiar to listeners of our Brian Nugent AIDS Diary series, reflected that, despite the devastating human cost of the AIDS crisis, some positive outcomes had emerged, notably advances in medical science, broader public education about sexuality, transmitted infections, improved standards of palliative care, and a mobilisation of communities to support those affected. Within the article, she briefly touches upon prison inmate Neil Carroll, where she writes, New South Wales prisons, where condoms and bleach are prohibited, are said to have benefited from AIDS. Quote, "It's introduced a new kind of compassion," says Neil Carroll, the inmate who initiated the successful AIDS peer education programme being implemented in jails across New South Wales. Quote, "It's made guys more caring of each other. Real dead-set gangsters who were pufter-bashers when they were 18 or 19 have found a cause and are now peer counsellors. It's also made inmates aware of their external image. They see warders telling the public on television they are raping each other and shooting up. Guys are afraid their wives and children will see this. I know lots of guys who have stopped using fits, syringes." And this advocacy, peer education work from Neil didn't just stop there, because I found several photographs taken for a newspaper but could not locate any accompanying article. Among them were images of Neil dated to the same period, June 1989, each bearing the customary back of photo blurb noting the story of the newspaper article, date and publication, which reads, Neil Carroll, an inmate of Long Bay Gaol, seen here on work release at the Albion Street AIDS Clinic circa June 22nd, 1989. Photo by Philip Wayne Locke of Fairfax Media. It seems Neil was perhaps on some form of gradual release, being allowed out of Long Bay's AIDS unit to take up voluntary work at the Albion Street AIDS Clinic. What he undertook there is unclear, but given the nature of his earlier work, it was likely peer support or health education. Either way, an astonishing turnaround. A prison inmate once confined and stigmatised, now stepping into a role that many on the outside with respectable jobs, mortgages and social standing refused, turning their backs on the AIDS pandemic, pronouncing it divine punishment or implying the afflicted deserved their fate. That contrast, a man emerging from incarceration to offer compassion, information and solidarity while supposedly respectable society looked away, lays bare the moral failure of those who hid behind righteousness and underscores the quiet courage of people like Neil who chose to help. But Neil's work was short-lived. Just under 2 years later, on the 17th of May 1991, Neil Ernest Carroll died aged 44. Son of Gwendoline and Jack Carroll, brother to Barry and father to Matthew. We heard earlier of the HIV-positive inmate who had been moved from Long Bay's AIDS segregation wing and transferred to the main population of another prison, Maitland, prompting hundreds of prison warders to walk out in protest and other inmates to threaten him with violence. Well, the same resurfaces again, where on the 14th of January 1990, the Sydney Morning Herald ran the headline, "Back Down on AIDS Victims Sparks Jail Row," where they report prison officers are angry over a decision to release 2 AIDS-infected prisoners into the general jail population at Long Bay and have warned they may take industrial action in protest. The move last week brings to a head a 5-year battle between prison staff and the Corrective Services Department to find a prison AIDS policy. The president of the Prison Officers Union, Mr. Dick Palmer, said the Minister for Corrective Services, Mr. Yabsley, had been warned that, quote, "the feeling among the officers at nearly all prisons is very strong on this issue. If he persists, there will undoubtedly be a major industrial response," he said. The prison officers argue that because of the unique circumstances of prison life, it is wrong to apply the principles of community-based AIDS management. Quote, "It's simply a fact of life in prison that there is no anonymity about such matters, that homosexuality is not uncommon, and that heroin is still available," Mr. Palmer said. It is also true that feelings of aggression generally run much higher inside prisons. Education is important, but it is stupid to pretend that if AIDS-infected prisoners are integrated into the general prison population, they won't be victimised or the officers won't also be attacked or put at risk in any other ways, end quote. Recently, one AIDS-infected prisoner had threatened to cut himself and throw blood over prison officers. Quote, "We believe that as few officers and prisoners as necessary should be exposed to such prisoners and that those officers should be specially trained. Training has been virtually non-existent," end quote. Oh, do you know, I don't even want to say that they're back at square one, because to a degree, it doesn't feel like they've even moved off square one. And it's gone on for 5 years, this arguing, this to-ing and fro-ing, and some of what we've touched upon has happened during that time, but let me assure you, in the newspaper articles, there was so much more that went on that I just can't fit into one single podcast. And sadly, while this debate fixates on the alleged dangers of HIV-positive prisoners being housed in the main jail population, the following month, July 1990, a 21-year-old newly qualified prison officer, Jeffrey Pierce, was stabbed by an inmate on the AIDS wing with a blood-filled syringe. In the final episode of this AIDS Behind Bars series, we will be dedicating that episode to the courageous story of Jeffrey Pierce, examining the circumstances of the attack, its aftermath for him and his colleagues, and the wider institutional and ethical questions it raised about safety, stigma, and care within the prison system. If you've enjoyed this episode, then don't forget to like, share and subscribe. And until next time, you can find me on Instagram at AIDS The Lost Voices.